What I thought I would do, and I could do some abstraction, as our last three speakers, who are very prominent American scholars and intellectuals. I'm not, but I could have go into abstraction. But I want to take this down, this discussion down, to the operational level. Because, with all due respect to Professor Appleby, I never ask staff at AID whether they are premillennialists or post-millennialists. I don't ask them whether they're members of the Sikh order or, you know, we don't do that in the federal government. And sometimes people will say some things which give you a little hint. But the reality is you have to get work done in the real world, and the real world sometimes defies abstraction and defies easy categorization. AID, and so I want to divide this talk into a discussion first about the role of religious institutions and religion in the implementation of the development policy of the United States government through USAID, and my own experience in that. I'm going to go through four case studies in that very quickly. But there has been a change. There was a change when President Bush took office, where there's an overt policy in the White House of encouraging the role of religion, mostly in domestic policy social programs, many of them in the inner cities, frequently with black churches, with Pentecostal churches, in poor areas. But since we're all part of the same administration, the policy was also applied to us. But there was no intrusion. I mean, no one called me up and said, you have to do this stuff. I saw it as an invitation to do something which is a little bit difficult in the federal government. The Foreign Service of state and AID is very secular, even for people of deeply religious conviction, and many of them are very deeply religious, but they never talk about it. In fact, I had a friend in the Foreign Service for 20 years, and he knew how committed I was as a Christian, and he took 20 years to tell me. He said, you know, he said he was an evangelical, not a fundamentalist, an evangelical, and he said, but I never tell anyone that because I don't know what happened to me in this atmosphere in Washington. But I wanted you to know that some of the things you say and do, I am not just going to follow because you're the administrator, but because I personally am sympathetic to some of the things you're trying to change. I think there is a nervousness because of the separation of church and state for our officers and diplomats to deal with the reality of the world. Peter Berger, who's a favorite scholar of mine at Boston University, once said, you know, secularism is a tiny little island in a sea of religious devotion in the rest of the world. In the developing world, you cannot deal with development or politics or anything else unless you understand the faith traditions of the societies. And it doesn't make any difference what country it is. And I also mean respecting the traditional religions that predate the great religious traditions in some societies. You have to understand where people are coming from, what their values are, because it has a huge effect on development. If a poor woman in a rural area with very high child mortality and maternal mortality rates believes that the reason her child is sick is because the river gods are angry at her for taking water out the wrong time of day from the river, we have to take that into consideration when you try to explain to her why her child is sick from diarrheal disease. Because if you don't, then you're not going to get her to change the way in which she provides water to the children. So let me talk a little bit about our practice and how that's evolved. It's certainly become more public, and it used to be that officers would hide this in the field. And very secular officers in AID do this, have been doing it for years, dealing with the great religious traditions. But they don't talk about it in Washington because it's seen as a secular place and it's seen as sort of politically incorrect. And this goes back decades. This is not a new phenomenon. Now it's easy to talk about. So I sort of started taking in stories, some fascinating stories about, and when I would travel, I had a rule that I would always ask to meet with the leaders of whatever the religious traditions of the society were. And I'm going to give you 4 examples of how that worked. I traveled to Macedonia just as it looked like Macedonia might go the way of Bosnia. And we were very worried about a massive civil conflict. You remember in, I think it was 2002 or 3, there was a conflict between the Macedonian Orthodox, or the Slavic side of ethnic Macedonia, This is the Republic of Macedonia. You notice my name. This is a sensitive issue in the Greek community about Macedonia. I want to get past that, but I'm talking about the Slavic Republic of Macedonia and the Balkans. And I was visiting, and there's a large, I think it's 25% of the population are mostly Muslim Albanian ethnically. And there's fighting starting, people getting killed, and it would look like it was going to blow up. So I went, and I told the ambassador, who's a very able career diplomat, I want to meet with a religious, and he said, why do you want to do that, Andrew? We've never done this before. I said, just do it. And I said, I'll take the conversation, and if people criticize you in Washington, I told you to do it, I'll take the responsibility for it. He said, okay, I'll do it. We had the Archbishop of the Macedonian Orthodox Church in the room, who was in his early 40s. He was a young man. He became a priest after communism, so he's not one of the old KGB types who was Orthodox. He was a very devout man. He had invited me to his small church in his monastery for the liturgy on Sunday, and I went. It was quite beautiful. And we had the imam of the Albanian Muslims. And we had a very small Jewish community, and they didn't even have a rabbi, and he came, the leader of the community came. And then there's a small community of Methodists from British missionaries converting people in Macedonia in the 1870s. Boris Tchaikovsky was at that point the president of Macedonia. He was a Methodist pastor, an ordained Methodist pastor. I think he got elected because he didn't threaten anybody because the community was so small. And the Jews didn't threaten anybody because there weren't too many of them either. So the two of them, in this meeting of the four religious traditions, the two small groups, the Jews and the Methodists, mediated between the Orthodox and the Muslims. It was very interesting. The first hour of the 2-hour meeting, they were very nice to each other and polite, and they had never met. These four people had never met before, which was very disturbing to me, but we brought them together. And the second hour, they got into it. And it wasn't, I was worried, I asked them if you make sure you didn't have any weapons in the room, because it got a little heated. But it was a real discussion, and it was civilized. And the ambassador said, I should have done this a long time ago. I'm going to do this again. I said, yes, but wait till I leave, you know. Once is enough. So the ambassador had a reception for me, and the four of them came, and they stood over on the side of the reception for 4 hours and talked. And they were quite animated, and we were a little worried, and the ambassador and I said, should we go over and talk to them? And I said, no, just leave them alone. They're not screaming. They're heated, but they're okay. Now, Macedonia turned out well. And, you know, being a political figure, I would like to claim credit for everything. I'm sure that we did not play a central role in this, but it didn't hurt that the imam and the archbishop were talking, and they got talking well after I left and the ambassador was involved, and they started having meetings, and they were going to issue a statement. The problem is the imam said, I will issue the statement if we don't have to translate it in Albanian, because if I do, I will get killed by the extremists. They will kill me if I do this. Because it talked about reconciliation and a peaceful way out of this confrontation. And I thought that was kind of sad. But the fact is, he mobilized, this imam, the more moderate voices in Islam, who actually, all of them were moderate voices. It was not Islam that was the problem. It was nationalism that had nothing to do with Islamic theology or the Islamic community at all. He was not one of the extremists. He was the opposite. The second story is I went to India to see our program. And we had just had a huge setback in the battle against polio. And I was, in fact, Secretary Powell and I were both enraged over it. We had, I don't know if you know this, but there's one disease that we've completely wiped out, scourge of humanity, and that is smallpox. And the way the international system works, if there is no one single instance of a disease, person getting a disease for 7 years, then it's determined to have been wiped out. And we now have wiped out smallpox. We were on the edge of wiping out polio. Only 3 provinces in Nigeria had it left, and we were about to immunize all the kids, and we thought we had gotten rid of it. And this, when I say we, I mean DFID, the British Aid Agency, AID, CETA, the Canadian Aid Agency, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, the NGO community. It was a huge coalition. And we did this for years to try to get this disease wiped out. And it was disgusting as to what happened. Some Salafists who were highly politicized, spread the rumor in these 3 provinces that we were sterilizing their children by immunizing them against polio. And the people didn't know the difference. I don't blame any of the people. And the governor said, there'll be riots in the streets if we allow you to do this, so they wouldn't let us do it. It got out, now it's all back all over the world, and we're gonna have to start all over again. We made a mistake. We should have engaged the Shura councils, the Muslim leadership, theologically on this issue to help us to counteract this, because most of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa are from the Sufist tradition, and the first people that were massacred in Afghanistan when bin Laden came in with the Taliban were all the Sufist orders. The Brotherhoods go back 500 or 600 years, and the Sufis tell me, at least, my friends are Sufis, that they are the bridge to Christianity and Judaism into the West, because most of them, not all of them, are pacific, and they're very open, and it's a mystical form of Sunni Islam. And I have to say, I've actually been in Sufist mosques in one of the Sufist orders in Morocco, and I heard their chants, and I thought I was listening to Orthodox chants in the Orthodox Church, except it was in Arabic. In fact, I go to an Arab Orthodox church, Antiochian Orthodox Church, and we don't have much Arabic sung anymore in the church, but there is a lot of connection between the Eastern Church and the Sufist orders going back 1,000 years. In fact, some of the theologians actually were close on both in Islam and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And so what we did in India is, to start from scratch, is we got the Shura Council together, we got a council of Islamic scholars, and they issued a fatwa. After we went through all the scientific evidence from Muslim doctors, if you do not have your child immunized, you are in violation of the Quran. They issued the statement. We didn't tell them to do it. We asked them, could you make a statement? He said, we will make a statement because this is outrageous. This happened, that these political people came in and disrupted this whole campaign. The same thing is being done now among the religious leaders in Indonesia. So I get, one of the things that troubles me about the debate in the United States, which, by the way, I don't want to disagree with some of our previous speakers, the president has gone a long way not to demonize Islam. He's repeatedly said Islam is a religion of peace, and he's been saying that from the beginning, and invited me, actually, to go with him to meet with Islamic leaders, without anybody from the State Department, which I thought was kind of interesting, when we were talking about these sorts of issues, very early, just after the 9/11 attack on the United States. And one of my best friends in Afghanistan, who was a mullah from Kandahar, his father was the first mullah executed by the Russians during the Russian invasion. He was a celebrated figure, and he grew up with Karzai. And he said these people who's caused this chaos in our country have nothing to do with traditional Islam. And he organized 1,400 mullahs to preach against Islamic extremism, which he said has been imported into our country. It's not our country. And Taliban, or whoever these groups were, tried to assassinate him 3 times on the entry to his mosque. This was in 2002, 2000. I would see him every time I went, and we had these long, wonderful conversations. He's a great man, a very, very, very courageous man. And he organized this whole effort in the Pushtun area to combat this extremism. And the 3rd time, they assassinated him. And my staff came in one morning, and he said, we have very bad news. And I knew what it was when they came in and told me. He had been assassinated on Friday prayers, just as he was walking into his mosque. So there is a war out there. I have to tell you, there's a war. And it's not a war with us and them. It's a war within Islam. And the Sufist orders are most under attack from these groups. They don't regard the Sufists as Muslim. I've had some of them tell me that, some of the more extreme element. They say the Sufis aren't Muslims. I said, well, they've been around for 1,000 years. It'd be really news to these great mystical traditions in Islam that they're not Muslims. In any case, so we did this in India, and the polio program went very, very well after that. And so that was a great success. I went to Ethiopia, and Ethiopia, the HIV/AIDS pandemic was beginning to spread, and I said, we need to enlist the Orthodox Church. And I got to be friends with the patriarch, and the patriarch invited me to meet with his archbishops, and we engaged them in a whole effort to teach his churches what HIV/AIDS was, how it was spread, how to prevent its spread, and he did a patriarchal tour Now, he was very proud of this, but the AID staff said he didn't tell you this, Andrew, but we planned the tour. He wanted to do it, but we planned it. We gave him a car. We drove him around, and for weeks he went into every village, and the Muslims revere the patriarch of the Orthodox Church. They get along very well, the Muslims. They're mostly Sufis. And then I met with the head of the Council of Imams, because 40% of Ethiopia is Islamic, most of them Sufist, as I said. And they engaged in this whole discussion. And there was a unified effort by the two great religious traditions of Ethiopia to combat HIV/AIDS. Now, some people in the United States criticized this and said, you know, you're relying on religious fundamentalists. And I said, wait a second. If you think I'm going to go tell the Imam of the Sufist church that he has to use condoms because, you know, you want them used, then I'm not going to do that. Or I'm not going to tell the Ethiopian patriarch that. It's up to them to decide that. They can do what they need to do to spread the word. Other people can use the condoms, and we massively increased the purchase of condoms at AID with the money from this huge increase, $15 billion program the president announced on HIV/AIDS. And I think they're beginning to get control of the pandemic as a result of that. But we don't ask people to violate their own religious traditions. I think that's offensive to do that, and they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. We need to engage the communities within their own universe and their own value system and not dictate to them how we should change their traditions and their religion. And the same thing is we've engaged with the Catholic Church in Bangladesh, in the Philippines and in West Africa on this, always within their traditions. And it's been very powerful and very helpful, and within the evangelical church all over Africa, which is very powerful as well. So those are some stories. The last story I would tell is a segue into the next comment I'm going to get into, and that's Sudan. Because I was the president's special envoy until the end of December. I resigned to go back to teach full-time at Georgetown. I've been engaged in dealing with Sudan for 18, 19 years now. I'm very emotionally devoted to the people all over the country, not just in the South, but was very close friends with John Garang, who was the leader of the rebellion, as you may know, and died in a terrible accident just after they signed the peace agreement between the North and the South, ending 22 years of civil war that killed 2.5 million people. And I went and saw the Imam el-Mahdi. The Imam el-Mahdi's great-grandfather was the Mahdi whose troops beheaded General Gordon in the 1870s in the siege of Khartoum. And the most celebrated family, I don't know quite how to, there's no way of describing anything in the US or Britain and Western Europe, because it's a combination of religious and political leadership that and his nephew, Sadiq al-Mahdi, was the last democratically elected prime minister who was unseated by the current Sudanese government in a coup in 1989. And I went to the Imam al-Mahdi, and he assembled the entire leadership of Darfur in Khartoum, all the old aristocracy, basically, and all the religious leaders, and we had a 4-hour conversation about it was October of 2006, about what was going on, what we needed to do. And one of the things that I want to talk about now is, and it was very useful. It was very useful for me. One of the things that troubled me in the conversation is their perception that we in the West, and I say this is not the religious right principally, it's the advocacy community, the human rights community, are demonizing the Arabs of Sudan because of what happened in Darfur, the terrible atrocities that were committed in Darfur. And they were the object of the atrocities. They said, well, why are you demonizing us? They killed our people too. This is not, everybody's a Muslim, and the only Christians are the relief workers, if there are any of them. So he was very troubled by this, and the elites in Khartoum are very nervous now that the intentions of the United States, driven by the advocacy campaign, is going after them as a group, instead of trying to fix the problem. And I think there is part in the American mindset of wanting to know who the good guys are and the bad guys are. And we take black hats and put them on one group of people, and we put white hats in another group. I have to tell you, I've been involved in this since 1989, and there are a lot of black hats. There are occasionally heroes, but there are not a lot of them. There are a lot of people with gray hats on. There were atrocities committed in the South. It's very sad for me to say that. I mean, I love the Southerners, I'm very close to them, but there were atrocities committed in the South. And a new book is coming out by one of the most respected Western scholars. He's a Brit, and I've known him for many years. And he asked me to read the galley proofs of it, and I said, Alex, how come this wasn't reported before? some of the rebel groups from the African tribes in Darfur were massacring Arabs in Darfur at the beginning of the conflict and raping Arab women. And he had detailed notes on it, detailed footnotes and conversations. I said, this got lost in translation. I didn't see this before anywhere in the reporting. And I think part of it, to be very frank with you, is this tendency in the United States to always want to find out who the good guy. Now, it's true in most social orders, anywhere in the world, that people who are more powerful with guns prey on people who are weaker. But you know, my observation is, and there's a lot of, Mary Anderson's written some wonderful books on this. You don't do this white hat, black hat, she says in her book. She says it in a different way, because they switch hats sometimes. You know, the people who are doing the oppression then become the oppressed. That's happening in the Balkans a little bit with the Serbian Orthodox. I'm a little troubled by this, you know, when Westerners dismiss the notion that the Orthodox monasteries and the Orthodox churches in Kosovo are going to be, oh, they'll be safe, they'll be fine, Andrew, there'll be no problem at all. That's not true. Those ancient churches and monasteries where there are young monks now, I've met many of the bishops, they're very holy men, they are not nationalists, and they're certainly not racist. And people have decided all the Serbs are bad, and all the Albanians are good, and that's not true. It's not true. It's the case that Milosevic committed terrible atrocities against the Albanians. But we should avoid this black hat, white hat thing, because it's more complicated than that. And by doing that, you limit American diplomacy. There's a whole bunch of things we need to do right now in Sudan we cannot do politically in this country. That's one of the reasons I resigned. Because I started to write, there's an article in the Washington Post, it should be today, it was supposed to be today, and the Outlook section of the Sunday Post on my view of what's happening in Darfur. And then I've written an article for Foreign Affairs, and I'm going to write a lot more because of this. People think, they keep using the word genocide to describe what's going on right now in Sudan. You'll notice none of the human rights organizations, the respected international organizations, use the word genocide anymore. They don't use it. I mean, it's very subtle, but it's not in there anymore. And the reason is most of 98%, 95% of the people killed in the atrocities in Darfur when 2003 and 4. By the end of 2004, most of the villages were burned down from these tribes that were in revolt. 2,700 villages are burned down. And they're in the camps, and they're relatively safe. There's still rapes going on, there's still bad, but it's at a much smaller level. Depending on whose estimates you get, between 250,000, the lower end, or 450,000 people have died. But what most people don't know, and this even people who are more extreme in their estimates and their rhetoric, who follow this in the advocacy community, admit that 75% of the deaths were not people getting killed. It wasn't like Rwanda. 90% of the people killed in Burundi were slaughtered with axes, with cutlasses. In Sudan, in Darfur, 75% maybe, we don't know exactly, died from dehydration, from starvation, and from disease because their villages were burned down. The other 25% were massacred. And there are mass graves all over Darfur. But the problem is at this point that the death rates are way down. Last year, we think about 1,000 people were killed, civilians were killed through violence. There are very few people dying from dehydration, starvation, because there is 13,000 aid workers, at a cost of $700 million a year. The US government's paying 60% of that bill. I helped set that whole process up with my friends in other departments of the federal government and in the UN system. And we're keeping everybody stable. It's a very, very tenuous situation. But this is the fear I have. We're forgetting about the rest of Sudan because the advocacy campaign and the church community was deeply involved in this. They do listen better, I have to say. There's a little humility in all of the tradition. When you try to tell them what the facts are, they at least listen. Some advocates scream at you and they will not. They don't want to listen to anything, particularly from people who are in the ground. And what's happened now is, as I said, about 1,000 people died last year. Half of them are Arabs killing other Arabs from the Janjaweed tribes because they're trying to steal the land of the Africans who are in the camps. The greater risk, very great risk, is that within the next year we could have massacres in Khartoum that will make Darfur pale in comparison. And it almost happened in October and November. The North and South almost went back to war. If the president had not intervened, I watched him do it. I was in the Oval Office with him when he did it with some leaders. And they pulled back the sides, and we calmed everything down. We've got a window of 4 or 5 months, and it's going to blow up again, between the North and the South, not in Darfur. There are 2 million Southerners who live in Darfur, in Khartoum. 2 million Southerners. They are all vulnerable. When John Garang was killed in that accident, we all assumed, myself included, that it was an assassination. There's no evidence of that, but that's what the fear was. There were riots. The Southerners living in Khartoum were burning Arab businesses down and burning Arabs alive. Some Darfuris, many of the Darfuri refugees went to Khartoum. They're not all in Darfur. And they were raping Arab Darfuri men, saying, "We are raping you because of what you did to your husbands and your community did to our wives and our daughters and our children," in retaliation for what happened in Darfur in 2003 and 4. So what I'm suggesting is there is simmering rage in this society, much greater than I realized before I was focusing on this as envoy. It is very dangerous and very explosive, and the Arabs are very nervous, including the opposition to the current government. We need a way out of this, and I'm afraid this focus on good and evil and bad guys and good guys is making it very difficult, because we know what we have to do diplomatically, privately. And we're prepared, I mean, the administration, I think, is prepared to do it. But they're worried there's going to be a furor, because the only way to work this is some carrots to the Sudanese government. We'll exchange ambassadors if you hold the elections, if you fix the Abyei, which is sort of the Kashmir of Sudan. It's a very provocative area. It's got to be fixed very quickly, or it's going to blow up. We need to, the sticks aren't working with Sudan. But you know, the sticks are necessary if it's good versus evil. If bad people are doing bad things, you need the sticks. That doesn't always work very well, and particularly in this case, because the Arabs think if they lose control, they're going to be slaughtered. And they think, for good reason, particularly the existing government, that they are going to be taken to the Hague, and this is my last comment, for war crimes trials. The need for justice and the need for peace in Darfur are not the same thing. In the United States, we have all these bumper stickers that say, if you believe in peace, work for justice. I believe in a country that's got laws every 2 inches. This country is just, our strongest institution is our legal system. And that's true in Western Europe as well, particularly in the United States, though. It is not true in Sudan and many developing countries. And to combine these 2 things, peace and justice, is in the context, in my view, of Darfur right now, is making it almost impossible to get a settlement, because the Khartoum government says if we lose control, if we lose the elections in February of next year that were required for the whole country between the North and the South, and we leave office, you're going to, and they say this to you, they say it to me over and over again, they're going to send us to the Hague for war trial. And we see what happened to Saddam Hussein. He got hung. We saw Charles Taylor's on trial in the Hague right now. And we watched what happened to Milosevic. Do you think we're going to give up control so you can arrest us? No, we're not going to do that. We'll never leave power, never leave power. So how are we going to have democratic elections? The Southerners say if we don't have democratic elections, we're going back to war. We're going to have those elections one way or the other. So we have got to pull back from this view that justice must be done through a Western court in The Hague, or whatever it is, wherever the ICC is, and people have been indicted, and the people, to be very, they should be indicted. I know what they did. They committed horrific atrocities. I watched it up close. But what is more important to the people in the camps who are still alive? Justice or peace? There's no big debate. They want to go back home and get their land back and put their lives back together. Now, the larger abstract argument, which people use, my friends in Europe use, and we worked on this together. And when I say this, my diplomatic friends in Europe all say, no, you're right, Andrew, but we can't say this publicly because it undermines the ICC. I think the ICC conceptually makes a lot of sense. The problem is, it's not making sense in reality. It's not ended the LRA, horrendous atrocities by the Lord's Resistance Army, because they tell you, one reason they're not going to sign a peace agreement is they're going to go off to the ICC for indictment. They're trying to make a deal now. I'm a little over, but let me just finish this last thought. I believe that the church and the mosque and the synagogue in this country have served, I think, wonderful purpose in many respects. And the principles in the abstract that they, rule of law, the idea of justice, make great sense. But we also have to look at the consequences of what those ideas are on the ground, reality, and crisis. That's my world. My world is Darfur. My world is the Ethiopian highlands. My world is the Shia slums in Baghdad, where 8 officers were, or what happened to the marsh Arabs under Saddam. People forget all the atrocities he committed. I mean, we went into the marshes and helped the marsh people who were almost completely wiped out by Saddam. That's the reality. And it's nice to talk in the abstract. We need to think about these things. We also need to look at the consequences practically on the ground of the kinds of things we advocate for here. The advocacy community, I want to say this, kept Darfur alive. Thank heaven. Thank heaven. But we need a little bit more flexibility now to attempt to put a peace deal together, or we are going to have a potential disintegration of the country. And I had an Arab diplomat tell me, he said, Andrew, it's going to open the gates of hell if they go back to war between the North and the South, or if you try to take this regime out by force. And there's lots of people in this country in the advocacy who want to do regime change. Anyway, those are my comments. I'd be glad to sit down now.